there are a lot of planes out there, or plane-like tools, that are very different than the bench planes that we've covered so far. So we're going to move beyond those and see what other planes you might want to have in your toolkit after you've gotten some basic planes. So I'm going to start with maybe at the beginning. This is a scrub plane used even before a foreplane. So this is very narrow, has a very curved blade, very simple plane. It's a bevel down plane, but doesn't really have much of a frog. It really doesn't have any frog, really. The blade adjustment mechanism is very crude. I mean, you just basically move the blade in and out and then tighten it down in the position you want. Very large mouth. So this is for really hogging material off of something. If you had, say, a particularly rough board, or maybe something that I've used a plane like this before when I was tapering the underside of a table surface that I had to remove about 1/2 inch of material over a fairly large width. So I used a scrub plane to really hog off a lot of material quickly. I could not have done it any other way with a saw or anything like that. So not something you're going to need a lot, but one of those things that when you do need it, it comes in handy. And that, of course, is going to be true of a lot of the planes I'm going to cover. Another plane that most people want to have is a shoulder plane. Now, a shoulder plane is a plane that the blade comes all the way to the edges. They typically are a little bit on the tall side, although this particular one is not. The smaller ones are 1/2 to 5/8 wide. The bigger ones are 1 inch, 1.25 inches. This is a Stanley 92. I bought this, I think, in around 2000. The older ones are nice. They still make a plane similar to this today. It's a little more sleek. And this particular one is 3/4 inch wide. So this works well. The shoulder plane technically is made for cutting the shoulders of tenons. So you'd be cutting end grain with this. It's a bevel up plane. I tend to use it more for trimming the cheeks of tenons, or the faces of tenons, just to kind of fine tune them to fit. I bought another one a couple of years ago. This one happened to come up. A friend was selling another friend's tools off. I think a husband had died and had a bunch of tools. So anyway, I'd always been looking for a wider version of this, but I didn't want a big shoulder plane. I'll show you in a sec. So this is a record, the 311, which I wasn't really even familiar with before I saw it, but it's about 1 inch or so wide. It is 1 1/8 inches. And I really like this. So once again, if I'm trimming the faces or cheeks of a tenon, this works great for that. And it's relatively low profile. It fits in your hand well. So I like this tool. I like this tool a lot. A more traditional shoulder plane is this one from Nielsen. So this is based on, I'm not sure, maybe a Clifton, but this is more typical of a shoulder plane, certainly a traditional one. Much taller, which would mean you could much more easily plane the end grain or the shoulders of a tenon, right? Because the tenon's going to be sticking up and you need to get your hand past that. So this is the Nielsen medium shoulder plane. They make a small shoulder plane that is think it's about a 1/2 inch wide. This is 3/4, and they make a bigger one that's an inch, 1.25 inches wide. Similar plane is this. This is the Veritas large shoulder plane. It is 1.25 inches, so I'm assuming the Lee Nielsen's 1.25 inches. They, as is typical of Veritas, have kind of redefined this tool. One thing I find interesting is they expect you to hold it with your hand back here, and they put this knob here so you can kind of move it around. And then I think I've seen where they want you to put your finger in here, but I mean, I've got big hands, and this is still a little awkward for me to hold. So I personally prefer to ditch this and hold it like this. Then I get my hand on top of it. I can put my finger here. There's another knob here that I'd probably get rid of that also. But this is a nice plane. It's big, it's heavy, basically the same width. I'm going to use this plane. And because I'm not usually trimming shoulders with it, I don't need that height, and this works great for what I want it to do. Another plane that you might be interested in, once you have a block plane, I don't want to say downside to a block plane, but one thing that might be better on a block plane is if the blade came all the way to the edge, or at least one edge. So this is the Lee Nielsen Skew block plane, and I'm sorry, it's the Siderabbet block plane. So a lot of things going on here because it's a rabbet plane. Typically when you hear the word rabbet and plane together, that means you can plane rabbets, of course. But what distinguishes it from another plane where the blade comes all the way to the edge, like a shoulder plane, is it has typically a fence. Okay, so this has a fence. And it also has a nicker, which is a blade that nicks, so to speak, the wood if you're cutting across the grain. So if I can get this off, there we go. So on this particular plane, it has this little blade here, and that blade sticks down below the bed. And if you were cutting across the grain, it would sever the fibers before the blade gets to the wood. So it'd be like chiseling before cutting, like we did on the pine block. This particular plane is a skew block plane, so the blade is skewed at an angle which severs the fibers a little more cleanly. And the other nice thing about it is because of that skewed angle, it tends to kind of pull the plane to the side, and it's more likely to keep the fence up against the edge of the wood. So this is I mean, if you're doing a lot of that kind of work, could be a handy tool. I personally don't have one. I don't know if I had one. I've used it very much, but we have this one at the school, and this is typical on these fences. There's a couple of holes here if you wanted to attach a piece of wood and make the fence longer. Another rabbet plane. This one from Veritas is this one. This is based on the Stanley number 78, I believe, or maybe also the 778. Also has a skewed blade, has a fence which somebody really tightened. And let's see if I can get this off. There we go. Okay, so once again, like I said, a fence, a much longer fence. And like I said before, because it has, or because it's a rabbet plane, it also has a Nikkor. It's got this blade that can be lowered down. It also, unlike the Nielsen Skew rabbet plane, has a depth stop. So you can set this to stop you at a particular depth. So this, if you're doing a lot of rabbits by hand, I would much prefer this to this. Just a bigger plane, it's a little easier to guide. And you know, typical Veritas has some nice features on it. So this is a great plane. I personally used to have a Stanley 78, but I used it so rarely I sold it a few years ago. Okay, router plane. Grab this one here. So a router plane is unique in that it's the only plane that cuts below the reference surface. And so, you know, right now this is set for, I don't know, about a 1/4 inch deep cut. So every other plane, you just keep planing and you keep removing material and it keeps going as long as you keep planing. This plane will, you have to adjust it after every cut because your reference is staying the same. Basically, in all these other planes, you're removing your reference. That's probably the best way to look at it. You're removing your reference as you go down. On this plane, your reference remains the same the whole time. So you can use this to make grooves. Okay, now I say grooves. You cannot use this easily to make dados. The dado goes across the grain, and because there's no Nikkor associated with this, there's nothing scoring those fibers before you cut them, does not work well. You get a lot of tear out. But this works great for making grooves. Probably the primary surface or purpose of this is to clean up the bottom of a groove or dado made a different way. So often you'll see people using these to fine-tune the depth of a dado or a mortise, particularly if you're installing a hinge. This is a great way if you're just coming down, you know, an 1/8 or 16th or 1/4 of an inch to inset a hinge into something. This is a great way to clean that up. This is an old Stanley. This particular one was made in England. It's a number 71. It's called an open throat because when this is not installed, this is open here. It makes it a little easier to see what you're doing. But if you are working on the edge of something, if I was, say, wanted to work here, I don't have support on the front. So in this particular one, I could mount this here. I know Nielsen makes this, their version of this in 2 different versions, an open throat and a closed throat. So the Veritas version looks like this. Theirs uses, they actually designed it so it uses the same blade as the old Stanley. Also has a fence, comes with it, so that mounts like that. And this is a closed throat. I don't think Veritas makes an open throat version of this. So router plane. This is a handy tool to have. It might be something that you might consider getting at some point. It can be very handy, like I said, for cleaning up mortises, fine-tuning things. Okay. Okay, next up, this is a plow plane. All right, so this is used to make grooves, okay, with grooves with the grain, not a dado. It has a fence. It has a very narrow bed, and in this case, this blade is a 1/4 inch wide. I think you can go as narrow as the bed, which is about 1/8 of an inch, and I think we have a blade that goes up to about 1/2 an inch wide. This is a nice tool. This is Veritas. I don't know that it was based on an old Stanley. I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Great tool, really works nicely. It's got nice ergonomics. It has a depth stop, and works good. The only thing this doesn't do if you're making grooves is it's not going to do a stopped groove. So if you need to say make a groove on the edge here, which we're going to do on the tote, the final project. 2 of the grooves can go all the way through, so we can use this plow plane, but 2 of the grooves have to start and stop before we get to the end. So this will not do that. So in that case, we will use the router plane to make those stopped grooves. All right. Interesting plane here is this. This is called a compass plane, all right? And notice the bed on it is very thin, okay? It's only a piece of spring steel. And the reason for that is this bed bends, okay? So this is a Stanley number 20. They made a couple of different versions of this. Some would look very different than this. This is a little more modern version, although modern is a relative term. So the way this works is if I loosen this lock nut and I turn this, you'll see I can change the shape of the bottom so I could actually plane a hollow into something. And if I go the other direction, I could plane a convex shape. So this is not something I use very often. I bought it, I don't know, probably 15 years ago. Comes in handy once in a while. I've used it for chair backs. The back or upper rail of a chair back, bandsaw it rough, and then use this to smooth it. I've used it for similar types of projects. It's a little tricky to use because this bed is, obviously not very stiff, so the plane tends to chatter. If you're not careful, it's got to be really sharp. You have to kind of hold it a certain way to make it work. It's one of those tools you got to hold your tongue in the right side of your mouth to make it work correctly. But it's pretty cool. Yeah, not something I use very often, but like some of these tools, comes in handy once in a while. Another tool that really falls into that category of use it rarely is this Siderabbet Plane. Okay, so if I had let's say a groove here that went with the grain, and I need to take a little bit of material off the side of that groove, or if it had a rabbet and I want to take a little material off the side of the rabbet, this plane actually drops down into that groove or rabbet and allows me to plane the side surface. So it's very narrow. It has a blade here that cuts the side of the part, and it's kind of it's double-ended, where you can go either direction with this. It's not something I use often. I've probably used it 2 or 3 times, just to kind of fine-tune something. It's very tricky to use. It's tricky to set up because you're just positioning the blade kind of by hand and by eye. There's no lateral adjustment, so if it's not sharpened just at the right angle, it tends to cut not parallel to the surface. But another one of those tools that, when you need it, kind of comes in handy. Nielsen makes a tool like this, or a plane like this, that is, they make them as a set. So you would buy a pair of these and you get basically half is the right and half is the left. It also has a knob handle on it, so it's a little easier to use because of that knob. So that's a Siderabbet Plane. Okay, that I think, we have talked about shooting planes, so I'm not going to cover that anymore. The next thing I want to show you is not a plane, it's a scraper. So, we've talked about card scraper. So this is a scraper, but it has handles on it, basically. And there's a name for it, and I'm blanking on the name. So it holds the blade at, about a 70-degree angle. In order to bend the blade, right? Usually when we're using a scraper, we want to bend the blade a little bit. It actually has a thumb screw here, so the blade is held in here by these 2 thumb screws in this bar, and then to bend the blade, you turn this, and that just pushes it out just enough. So that also kind of affects your depth of cut. It's kind of a coarse tool. It's a little tricky to use and not get chatter. You got to take a very fine cut. It's got to be very sharp. You really got to be pushing down on it. Something I very rarely use. The next level up from this is this Stanley number 12. So similar in that it's a scraper. It's got a blade, in this case a fairly heavy blade. It's held in with a lever cap, so you turn this and it levers down, holds this here. But this one actually has a handle, so it's gives you a little better grip on it. This adjustment here, by turning these knobs, it changes the angle of this, and because the pivot is up here back behind here, as you change the angle, it kind of adjusts the depth of cut a bit. So similar to the other one in that it's a little tricky to use. It's got a fairly short bed. It's a little hard to not get chatter with this. You really have to make sure it's sharp and take a fine cut. There is also a scraper plane that has this mechanism, but it has a knob like a regular plane and a handle back here. So it works, it's a much better tool ergonomically than this. Nielsen makes that. Stanley used to make one a long time ago. I don't think Veritas makes anything like that. So you would use that if you did a lot of work with really squirrely woods that tended to tear out very easily. So I think that's it for those, I did want to just briefly cover some wood planes that I've made. So I've got, I don't know, half a dozen of these, and I guess I'll start with this one. So this, the blade's not in this one, but this is a Krenov style smoothing plane. It's what, 9-10 inches long. So these planes have, this is a little longer one. They're made in 3 parts. So you start with a block of wood, you cut off these 2 pieces, and then cut the features in here so that the blade sits on the bed, and then you've got this piece on the toe, so you've got a good mouth there. You drill some holes for this cross pin. The cross pin is used used for the wedge, and then it has basically a standard blade, a very thick blade, about 3/16 thick, and a chip raker. So these planes, they just work really well. I think the main difference is having a wood plane and having the wood on wood as opposed to metal on wood just gives you a different feel. And of course the ergonomics are very different. This particular one is, I don't know what you'd call it, but it's pretty swoopy. So this would be more like a jack plane in that, I don't know, 12, 14 inch range. I tend to use these more as smoothing planes. So I have several of those. This one I just showed you, which I tend not to use too much anymore. This is probably my favorite one. This is about 8 inches long. It's made out of a very hard wood, bacote. It has a ash wedge, a 50-degree bed angle. It's got an ebony pin here. It's very heavy. This wood is very hard, very dense. I love this plane. It's really sweet. I've got an even smaller one. This one is also 8 inches. Is that the one I just measured? This one is about 7 1/4, very small. This has a 60-degree bed angle. So if I really find some nasty wood, I'll switch to this one. I've got I would consider this a jointer. It's not as long as a number 7 or number 8, but this works really well for straightening the edges of boards. This one, I wanted one where I was pushing a little further forward than this, and I saw a similar plane somewhere. So I really like the ergonomics of this one. This works great. They're all the same in terms of a cross pin, a wedge. The blades are all the same. So this is really a sweet plane to use. The most recent one I've made is this one. So this is very boxy. Doesn't look like it'd be good to hang on to like these other ones, but the reason for that is this is a shooting plane. Okay, I wanted to try making a wood shooting plane, right? One's going to land on its side, but the main reason I wanted to do that is I wanted a lower cutting angle. All the shooting planes that we have are either like the number 51 has a typical bench plane frog in it, which means the cutting angle is 45 degrees, or this plane, which is bevel up, 20-degree bed angle. If you've got a 30-degree bevel, right? You want a fairly steep bevel, so that's a 50-degree cutting angle. I wanted to see if I could get a lower cutting angle, right? We're cutting end grain with a shooting plane. So this has a 40-degree bevel angle. I'm sorry, 40-degree bed angle, right? Bevel down, so it's a 40-degree cutting angle. The other thing that's different about this, if you were to hold this, you would immediately notice it's very heavy. What I did after I had these parts, everything cut apart, I drilled holes in the center section, and I've epoxied inside here a bunch of lead shot. So this plane is very heavy compared to what it would be if it was just wood. And this thing, I was really thrilled with how this thing worked. It really works great in shooting end grain, just because of that low angle and because of the weight. So that pretty much covers all the specialty planes that I have available. I'm sure there's more, but I can't imagine what else you would need for your woodworking endeavors.